Hello, everyone. My name is Ilyas Belfoul. I am director at WISE, the World Innovation Summit for Education, and I'm very happy today to moderate this panel discussing about EdTech and EdTech partnership, scaling partnership in Africa. It is great to partner with Holland IQ. I think Holland IQ are doing a series of events. Have a look at their website to look at all the events that are happening the next 6 months. It's remarkable, and I want to congratulate Maria and Patrick for bringing us together in this series of in-person and virtual events that are greatly needed in the current context of transformation we live in. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about scaling EdTech through partnerships. We're going to talk about some opportunities, some challenges, and we have with us four great panelists coming from different parts of the world. So I'd love to introduce you to them, and then we will hear a few seconds from each one of the panelists about the work they do, and we're gonna start by a first question. So we have with us today Kenza Bouhaj, who is a Harvard student and a fellow at GSD Ventures, Khadija Al-Badawi, CEO and founder at Praxi Labs, Asad Rahman, practice lead venturing at Brink, plus experimentation lead at EdTech Hub, and Alim Ladha, he's the founder and CEO at Instill Education. I'd love to start with you, Khadija. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you do? And then we move to Kenza, and then Asad, and then Ali.
Sure, thank you, Ilyas. And first of all, very honored to be here with you guys. And Holland IQ is really doing an amazing job, and the reports that they are publishing in the very recent years are really helping us startups a lot now. So basically what we do at Praxi Labs is that we are helping students and universities around the world with the main challenges that we are seeing now with traditional labs. So the restricted access to the lab, the safety hazards, the costs, all the issues that we really all know in STEM education. We're trying to solve this by giving like a kind of a lab to every student. So it's a virtual environment, an immersive one that gives students the time and to practice experiments in physics, chemistry, and biology from anywhere they are. And it's really helping a lot, especially in the problem that we are also seeing, which is the higher rate of STEM dropouts now. So that's it.
Thank you, Kenza.
Thanks, Ilyas. Happy to be here today. In my work, I hope to bring exposure of EdTech and the great opportunities of EdTech in Africa, both from a commercial standpoint, but also and especially from an impact standpoint. So I do that through exposing EdTech founders to VC funding, international VC funding in EdTech, and also through my writing and through convening people at various conferences, just bringing the limelight onto EdTech in Africa.
Thank you, Asad.
Yeah, thank you, Ilyas. Thank you for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here with such illustrious co-panelists. I'm Asad. I lead the venturing practice for Brink, an innovation agency where we help to fund and scale ideas that we think will have a big impact in the world. And I'm the experimentation lead for the EdTech Hub, which is a global EdTech research and innovation partnership. And in that role, we bring together governments, startups, researchers, and NGOs to test and integrate how EdTech can become part of education systems.
Thank you, and Alim.
Great, it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm Alim Ladha. I'm losing my voice. I'm the founder of Instill Education, and our aspiration is to reimagine the way we train teachers on the African continent. So we are an accredited higher education institution in South Africa, so training the next generation of educators for the continent. And we are also supporting teachers throughout their journey in professional development. So we have a technology solution supporting currently 60,000 teachers across the continent in the continuous journey of improving your practices and your skills. And I'm really excited to be here.
Very excited to be here with all of you. Thank you very much for this quick introduction. Alim, I'll just stay with you since you operate in the continent. I want to ask a question. Why we're still, and how come we're still insisting, and some media are still insisting in approaching Africa as a one place rather than 54 countries, and how this, kind of mistake plays in the dynamic of partnerships when you operate in the continent?
It's a really good question, Elias, because it's a question I've been wondering myself for the last 20 years about why we keep looking at the continent as a monolith, right? We have the North that speaks primarily Arabic. You have Francophone countries that have colonial histories that have been inherited from France. You have British Africa or former British colonies. You have Portuguese Africa, and they're completely different in terms of context. I think the reason most people don't see this as 54 countries because they are not spending any time here. I think that's what it comes down to, whether it's the media, and I'm going to also point the finger at all the venture capitalists sitting in the US, sitting in their fancy nice offices talking about Africa as the next billion and a half, because they're comparing it to India, because they're comparing it to China, and they're seeing, well, that's the next billion and a half, but they actually haven't set foot on the continent, right? And the challenges it poses for us as a venture is relatively simple. They're expecting to look at scale as the way you look at EdTech scale in India or in China, where you have some commonality of language, you have some commonality of policy, you have some commonality of structure, which ultimately you don't have on the continent, right? And that's where the biggest challenge comes from, because you're having conversations and they're like, well, great, you've got X million users in this country, why can't you have another million users? When would you get to 10 million? You're like, actually, it's 54 partnerships I have to think about on the continent. So my journey is not as hockey stick, pardon my buzzword. It's actually a bit more organic and linear, and it takes a lot more time to build these relationships.
Yeah, terrific. Have you, Asad and Kenza, have you faced the same type of challenges, let's put it this way, the way Alim have described it, or do you focus on a certain area within the continent?
Yeah, I'm happy to double down on what Alim has said. I completely agree. I mean, Africa is a very heterogeneous continent. Just if we're thinking about, what enables EdTech, there's the fundamentals are infrastructure, our data connectivity, our mobile connectivity, hardware and software costs. All of these things are very different in a place like Nigeria versus a place like the DRC. So I think it's very important for the international community to understand that those markets are very, very different. And this is where I see my role in bringing that awareness to the VCs that are sitting in Silicon Valley, to make them understand that this is a very big continent. Yes, there's a lot of opportunities out there, but the exponential growth that we would expect in stable and mature markets, we cannot expect in the 54 African countries. So definitely, I think it is a challenge, but also an opportunity to educate the world that the reality might be a bit different on the continent.
Thank you, Kenza. I see you, Asad, wanted maybe to add. So we met you've been operating in Rwanda, Asad, but you're covering East Africa. What is the difference between the work you do in East and West Africa?
Yeah, it's a super question, Ilyas. And recently I was at eLearning Africa in Kigali, and there was a real tension between people criticizing a lot of EdTech organizations for translating their content into Swahili, replacing the skin color of icons or animations in their EdTech product, and saying, okay, now we're fit for Africa and we're going to scale all over Africa. There was a tension between people doing that and people demanding things to scale to address the global learning crisis, where there are hundreds and millions of children not learning either in school or out of school. So I think there is a real tension there. And Rwanda, where I was, often calls itself a proof of concept country, where things can land before scaling across, particularly East Africa. But within EdTech, I do think it's a challenge because making something contextually relevant is so important.
Thank you for these clarifications. Khadija, you operate in Egypt. Do you have partnerships as well in other part of the continent? And what do you see some of the obstacles that you're facing as an EdTech founder?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes. So actually, we started only operating in Egypt. That was like 7 years ago, but now we worked in like more than 16 different countries in all the continents. And I would say that Africa has been the most difficult for us. So it's not nice for me to say that, but even coming from Egypt, I've seen the partnerships. The most difficult thing to do is in Africa. And coming back to Alim's word, for example, the thing is, we have a lot of differences in culture, in language, and just everyone is expected you to get your platform, which is scalable because it's an online platform, and take it directly from Egypt to Nigeria, or take it to Kenya, or take it to South Africa, because they are advanced and they are really trying to do a lot of things in digital education now. But the problem is, you can't go there by yourself as an Egyptian company, for example. You don't understand them. You are not the same as the companies there. So in order to really be there and succeed, the partnerships comes here, and it's very important to do partnerships with well-established and local companies. But even trying to do this, we found it very, very difficult. And one of the things I've seen, Elias, and I really, again, I'm not happy to say that, but there is a lot of, I wouldn't say lack of trust, but you need to build trust, and it takes time. And because it takes time, some people are not patient to go through all this process. You really need to wait, and some people just want the quick win. They want to go there, do a project, and that's it. And we don't want that. We want to make sure that we are partnering with the same people or the same mentality, the same values. So we try to take it slowly, but then looking at the long vision, for example, or the long-term goals. And we don't see a lot of people trying to, or understanding that this is really crucial for making the right partnership and going to the market. And I believe that a lot of people are trying to do so much help now. So for example, Africa Business Heroes, I've been with them, I've been the winner, and they are trying to do a lot of help inside countries such as Africa. And I'm now trying to like collaborate with a lot of heroes from these markets, just to understand, like Kenza was saying, you can't find research easily talking about how do you do business in Nigeria if you were doing it in Egypt, for example. The business model is completely different. People want, for example, the solution in a different way. People have infrastructure challenges, maybe even more. So I think really like it needs a lot of maturity still. It's not there yet. So we need to work together and find some solution to how to get to the partnership level, and work slowly towards that.
Thank you very much, Khadija. This give me a really nice segue to go to Kenza. Kenza, we've been talking, for example, about the challenges regarding the infrastructures and the level of information available even at a research market. Where do you position those realities versus this whole buzz around, all the opportunity? The next big thing is happening in the continent. So can you just bring back a certain balance to the conversation, because there's still lots of challenges, and folks out there, I think, need to know what are some of these challenges.
Yeah, I do think there are a lot of challenges at the macro level, like I said, starting from infrastructure, at the micro level, like purchasing power, GDP per capita, differences in languages, in legislation, like Alim was saying. So I do think there's a lot of challenges, but at the same time, I think I'm a huge optimist, and I do think there's a lot of opportunity in education. We often forget that African countries spend about the highest share of GDP on education of any other region in the world. So there's already a huge market with the government in terms of education. And I'm not even talking about private spend on education, that more than, for example, in Nigeria, 40% of the K through 12 student population is now in private schools. That is this trend that I'm seeing in a lot of other African countries. So the move towards private education will also create a market both for B2C and B2B EdTech. So I do think there is a lot of reasons to be optimistic. There's a lot of reason to, yes, believe that Africa is the next big thing in EdTech. My challenge is that a lot of VCs, a lot of companies do not want to take that risk because of all the fundamental issues. And even before, this very hard VC market right now, they didn't want to. And my view is that if you invest early, if you pour in resources right now, you're just going to be in a better position to be at the forefront when the revolution actually starts. And I honestly give it 10 more years for us to start seeing the results that people want to see and the scale that people want to see. So I think we need to be realistic, yes, but at the same time, I think optimism here, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic.
The description of you sounded very positive when you said that there's more private schools than public schools, and is the government failing, or we need more of the private just because the government itself cannot take up this massive challenges to educate people, and since education is a top priority for Africa, and I'd love to hear you, Kenza, and then I'm gonna move to Alim as well, and make a connection to the work he does with the government. Kenza.
Yeah. I think we'd all love to have effective quality public education that is free and accessible to all. I think that would be the ideal utopia that we'd all hope and wish for. I think the reality is, unfortunately, governments have not been able to deliver on that promise. And so we turn to an affordable and quality private sector to fill in that gap. So that was, and I said that comment more from the perspective of the commercial opportunity in EdTech is there and is growing. But obviously, I would love for all education to be accessible to all.
Great. Alim, you are in a very noble business. You want to basically train the teacher, because the role is very important to pass on the knowledge to the learners. You've been working mainly. And I'd love to hear the connection you have with the government versus the corporation, and make a link to what Kenza mentioned about these opportunities and also some of these challenges.
Look, I'm going to echo what Kenza said. You can't do what we're doing, what all of us are doing here, if you're not optimistic about the prospects of the continent, right? At the same time, I always resent this idea that we look at the continent as a whole. Because ultimately nobody looks at Europe as a whole. Nobody will say, well, you're doing it in France, why can't you do it in Spain? You're like, well, why are you applying the same framework on the continent, right? So for us, what that's meant is you tend to go slower. Context matters. So in the work that we do, for instance, in Ghana, we're working very closely with government. Training teachers means that what we are training them on aligns on national standards. Most African countries have spent a lot of money on national standards. They've got pretty strong frameworks today. Rwanda just, I think, introduced one about 3 or 4 years ago. That is a very solid teacher standard, right? So we are working hand in hand with government. When we roll out a solution space, we have to remember that government's not incentivized to take risk, because there's political risk to taking risk with you. If the innovation that you're trying to bring on the table is not going to work, they will pay the price. Of course, we will pay the price because our investors will walk away or whatever, but they pay political price. So we tend to work with government to pilot, then demonstrate both the contextual elements of what we do and the efficacy that we do. There are places where it is a lot harder. So in certain countries we're working, I won't name them, it is a lot harder to work with government because they have their own set of priorities and directions they're going. And these are places where it's better for us not to be fully engaged and be good citizens to do that. But I think the conflict that comes with, in two ways. The conflict comes also from the fact that your investor base is looking for returns, applying the same frameworks they've applied in the US or in Europe or in India or China. And you're like, well, we're an 8-year-old startup. We're just taking traction for the work that we're doing. It's taken us 8 years to build trust that we will be here. Now have that in the timeline most investors are looking at investments, and you have a bit of a clash. Just a quick note on private sector, and I won't monopolize the time. I think the private sector, I'm less optimistic about the private sector on the continent, mostly because I think they're poorly behaved most of the time. Most of them see this as an opportunity for profit grab. which is why you're seeing a lot of pushback both from NGOs, civil society, and government around the role they're playing. While I do believe that for us to solve the education challenges on the continent, it's going to require the private sector, the social sector, and the public sector to figure out how to work and coexist. In the absence of a really good policy framework in most of these countries, the private sectors doesn't produce much better outcomes, but they're producing profits for their owners. And to me, this is where we found tension in the work that we do, where we ask them to get data around outcomes so we can measure whether what we're doing is having a difference, and you get pushback to say, wait, you just train people and get paid for it, and we'll figure the rest out. And I'm like, no, time out. We want outcomes data. And that puts them in a very difficult position. For us, we tend to walk away when that happens.
The accountability level when you work, isn't it sometimes more efficient at the private sector than the public sector? Because you also have a level of incentive that folks who go and pay for those training, they're gonna take the learnings and they're gonna apply it. Where sometimes, and I'm not, without being any judgmental, sometimes the government level, they will just put folks on a training because they almost you have to go and train, but they're not taking those learnings into practice.
So look, it hasn't been our experience. Right? It hasn't been our experience. I mean, there is a reason why a large portion of EdTech startups on the continent don't focus on teachers, because actually it's a very complex one to crack. They're not well paid enough. There's no incentive for them to do professional development because there is no, for lack of better language, return on investment for them, right? There's no better promotion. There's no better salary. There is nothing in it for them. They're doing this out of the goodness of their heart. And then I ask all of us and all our viewers, when's the last time you do PD for the sake of PD in your busy schedules and your little salary? So what I found is that often when government have set up the policy framework and are comfortable implementing that, you're able to start getting teachers to do that. And we see that in the public sector. In the private sector, the pushback we often get is, so three types. You do have private players that absolutely care about teacher quality because they make a link between, if my teachers are better, my students are better, my parents will pay more, and I could create a wheel around it. Right. But I also see, as many people will tell me, literally, and I've heard this so many times, is every dollar I give you and your product is a dollar not in my pocket. And I have a lineup of parents that have lost faith in the public sector. So, they want to leave. It's okay. I've got another 20 parents ready to go. And that tension also plays out. So I think accountability is complex, right? And so for us, we tend to then engage with those who are interested to work in that framework to say, let's make the teacher better and let's measure whether it's working or not. Because if it's not, we shouldn't be around and you should be paying for us, right? It does require a bit of courage on our side to walk away from money. It takes our investors to be comfortable also to say, hey, you're walking away from a commercial opportunity. But I think for us, the impact is important, but it's a tension.
I am taking note of this, Alim, and I will propose to Maria and Patrick to have a follow-up conversation just on this topic, because that's fascinating, and I think there's so much that we could learn from this experience, because you've been courageous enough sometimes to just not go for necessarily for the profit, and you're focusing much more on getting an impact out of the training. Asad, you are working with the EdTech Hub. You have an ecosystem dimension, and obviously most of your work, Asad, is also related with government. What are some of the similarities with Alim, or some of the things you have been observing when you work within that ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks, Ilyas. So I think building on what Alim mentioned about the risk that governments take with EdTech, I think one thing that I've seen that I've been really impressed by actually in Rwanda is they have a program called Ilumu Soko, where they've built a clearinghouse and testing lab for EdTech before it becomes integrated into the education system. So it's a space where they work with different EdTech partners from actually all over the African continent, do rigorous and rapid but small-scale testing, give the innovators a really clear, yes, we will integrate you if you do this, and really de-risk their further investment. And I think this is really important because it gives EdTech startups a sort of accessible way into working with government, which I know a lot of the time the government and donor nexus can seem quite impenetrable to startups that are working. So I think that's one thing I've been really impressed by. I do think maybe the second point I'll make is where I've seen the most success from governments is where they have a very clear mission which they own. And I think there's writing from people like Mariana.
We're having a little connection issues with Assad. Maybe I jump to you, Khadija, and while we're waiting for Assad, would you like to comment on any of the conversation we've been having? We have about 4 minutes left.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the most parts that I would really like to comment on, because we were all here talking about the projects and the private sector and the public sector, for example. I do actually agree with Kenza on that the private sector is now increasing, or that the private schools, for example, are increasing because just the government can do it all. But I also agree with Alim that they are really into it only for profit. I've seen it I've worked in Egypt, I've worked in Saudi Arabia and Oman, in a lot of countries, and actually in Liberia now. So we've worked in different countries, and you tend to see the same exact thing. Business owners are there to do private university or a private school just to gain millions of pounds out of it, and whatever they can just cut out of the money, they will take it for themselves. So they are not going to invest in whatever it is. So going there with a virtual lab platform that could solve problems for their students, we've seen it the same way. So the mentality is, can I do without it? It's not, what are the benefits of having the solution? The first question is, do I really have to pay for it? I can just live without it. But your students are really going to have values out of this. They are going to improve their learning outcomes. You are going to actually have a better retention, etc. But I believe that on the other side, the public sector, they wouldn't tell you that, because if they have funds, they need to put it. So actually, I believe that we've been working with the public sector better than the private sector, because they get the fund from the government or from NGOs or from the USAID, for example, and they need to allocate it for a specific project. So once we convince them that, yes, we will allocate it to that project, and you're going to prove to your fund, for example, they have criteria that you put this fund into virtual labs, for instance, or virtual education, whatever the platform is, they are going to be convinced much easier than the private sector. So I believe that this is a bit of difference for myself as a startup. And one last thing on the government part, as I was mentioning, so it's very nice to have. I wish I could work with all the governments around the world, but just a change of a regime or a government would throw all my efforts and work away. I don't want to take the rest of the time because Assad is back, so this was a quick note.
Assad, I'll come back to you. Do you want to add anything else? Because we unfortunately lost the connection with you. So do you want to conclude on your idea?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm showcasing some of the challenges with EdTech on the continent. I'm not sure where I got cut off, Ilyas. I was talking a little bit, I think, about the example of Ilumisoko as a testing lab in Rwanda, and then the last point I wanted to make was around the importance of government having a mission. For example, in Zanzibar, I was doing some work with the government, and they have a very clear mission to reduce dropout rate among 11-year-olds from 25% to less than 5%. And yeah, that sense of mission really helps them to engage the EdTech ecosystem around something that everyone can rally on. Without that goal, I've often seen governments just pursue EdTech for the sake of EdTech, or EdTech for the sake of tech. So I that point on mission.
Now that's very clear. That it obviously it makes sense that when you work with a government that is mission driven and organized, and they have a strategy and they have a roadmap, it makes probably life of any entrepreneur and everyone who want to operate in that market much easier. We have a minute left. I have a big question for Kenza, but I don't know if we have enough time to go in detail. We see right now investment in EdTech in Europe. Basically, the market in Europe seems to be the best for EdTech investment or EdTech raising funds. It's slowing a little bit in the US. What's the status of raising funds or implementation of some EdTech in Africa?
It's nowhere where we want it to be. It's still very, very, very early, very nascent. I think we need some, before VC starts coming in, and it will come, it has come in fintech, it will come in EdTech at some point in the future. Before it starts coming, I think we need another form of capital that is not philanthropy. So I think philanthropy sometimes encourages behaviors that do not promote accountability. So we need some other bridge. I call it patience capital that is not necessarily VC, that would allow for the growth that Alim was talking about, that is not exponential because of the realities of the continent. At the same time, that the investors in this patient capital model are can take in the risk and are a bit more patient before they can get their returns, before we get to the traditional VC type funding that it's inevitable that it will come, but it's nowhere near any of the levels in India or Europe or USA.
Thank you. We're already 1 minute over, but I just want to give 10 seconds each person to say a word of goodbye, and we're gonna definitely give a proposal to the team that we need longer conversations for the next round of event. Khadija, Alim, and then Asad.
I've been honored, and I really like the conversation so much. There's so much actually we can do in partnerships between the panelists ourselves. So I'll definitely get connected to each of them. So that's the first partnership I would do. Yeah, that's all.
Great.
I'm just going to echo what Asad said. The Limusoko project has incredible potential for EdTechs. So if any of you EdTechs are watching, please reach out and read about this, because I actually think the potential on the continent for this to work is really powerful. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Alim. Thanks, Ilyas. Thank you to the fellow panelists. I think this conversation has just made me much more excited about EdTech. It's easy to get tunneled into your day-to-day, so it's very nice to broaden out.
The last thing I will say is that the entrepreneurs know best. So all of you investors watching, always listen to the entrepreneurs.
Well, on these wise words, I want to thank you, panelists, for this great conversation. I certainly wish that we have more time, but we will be seeing each other in the future, and we will hopefully be organizing other events together. Thank you very much for your time, and we wish you a happy good day.
Thank you, Ilyas.